Part 3, the letter that finally made him cry. Thomas carried the envelope upstairs and closed his bedroom door behind him. Evening sunlight stretched across the floorboards in long golden bands. Outside, the village settled into the quiet rhythm of another summer night. A wagon rolled somewhere down the road. Birds called from distant trees. The world sounded peaceful. Yet inside the small room, Thomas felt as though everything had stopped moving. The envelope rested in his hands. His name stared back at him. Thomas. Written in Emily's familiar handwriting. He traced the letters with his thumb. For a long time, he did nothing else. The fear remained. Not fear of what the letter might say. Fear of what it might make him feel. Months earlier, he would have opened it immediately. Before the funeral. Before the silence. Before he learned how to survive one day at a time without letting himself think too much. But now every memory felt dangerous. Every reminder carried weight. He sat on the edge of his bed and stared through the window. The sky glowed orange above the rooftops. Somewhere beyond the village, church bells marked the hour. Finally, Thomas slipped a finger beneath the seal. The paper opened with a soft crackle. Inside was a single folded sheet. Nothing more. No photographs. No keepsakes. Just a letter. He unfolded it carefully. Emily's handwriting filled the page. At first his eyes moved slowly across the words. Then faster. Then slower again. She had written about ordinary things. The birds near the stream. Aunt Clara's cooking. A joke Thomas had told weeks before. Small memories. Gentle memories. The kind that made a person smile without realizing it. As he read, he could almost hear her voice. Not perfectly. Not completely. But enough. The room no longer felt empty. Emily seemed present somehow, living inside the lines of ink she had left behind. Thomas swallowed hard and continued reading. Halfway down the page, the letter changed. The sentences became more personal. More serious. Emily wrote about the future. She wrote about hope. She wrote about believing that difficult seasons eventually pass. Then came a paragraph that forced Thomas to stop. Reading altogether. She had written it the night before she asked for his promise. The realization struck him immediately. Emily knew she was worried. She knew Thomas would carry responsibility far beyond his years. She knew he would try to protect everyone around him. Even at the cost of himself. His hands tightened around the paper. Slowly he continued. Each word seemed heavier than the last. Outside, evening shadows lengthened across the village. The last sunlight faded from the window. Still Thomas read on. Then he reached the final lines. The room fell completely silent. Emily's final message occupied only a few sentences. Nothing dramatic. Nothing complicated. The words were simple. Honest. Written by a sister who knew her younger brother better than anyone else. Thomas stared at the last sentence again and again. If you are reading this, it means you stayed strong for longer than you should have. You do not have to carry everything anymore. You do not have to protect everyone. And you do not have to be brave for me. I already know who you are. Thomas stopped breathing for a moment. The page blurred. He blinked and looked down again. The sentence remained exactly where it had been. He read it once more. Then again. The promise he had guarded for months suddenly felt different. Not broken. Not abandoned. Understood. For the first time since the funeral, he realized something that had never occurred to him before. Emily had never asked him to stop feeling. She had only wanted him to keep going. And somewhere between those two ideas, Thomas had lost himself. Thomas remained on the edge of the bed long after darkness filled the room. The letter rested in his hands. Outside, crickets sang beneath the summer sky. A gentle wind moved through the open window, carrying the scent of grass and distant rain. The village slept. Thomas did not. He read the final sentence again. Then again. Each time the words seemed to reach deeper. You do not have to be brave for me. For months he had built his entire world around a promise. Every chore. Every silent meal. Every sleepless night. Every memory pushed aside before it could hurt. He had convinced himself that strength meant never breaking. Yet Emily's letter revealed something he had never considered. Perhaps strength was never the point. Slowly, Thomas folded the letter and placed it beside him. The room felt different now. Not lighter. Not happier. Simply honest. For the first time since the funeral, he stopped fighting the memories. They arrived almost immediately. Emily laughing beside the stream. Emily teaching him how to whistle through a blade of grass. Emily sneaking extra jam onto his bread when Aunt Clara was not looking. Emily sitting by the window during rainstorms, counting seconds between flashes of lightning and distant thunder. One memory followed another. Hundreds of them. Small moments. Ordinary moments. The kind people rarely notice until they are gone. Thomas closed his eyes. He could hear her voice. Not perfectly. Not clearly. But enough. Enough to remember who she had been. Enough to remember who he had been when she was still there. Something shifted inside him. A pressure that had been building for months began to move. Not all at once. Slowly. Like ice beginning to crack at the end of winter. He lowered his head. His shoulders trembled once. Then again. At first he did not understand what was happening. The feeling was unfamiliar. Almost frightening. Tears gathered in his eyes. He blinked hard. For months he had stopped them before they could fall. This time he did not. A single tear landed on the folded letter. Then another. The dam broke. Thomas covered his face with both hands. Every memory returned at once. Every goodbye he never spoke. Every moment he had locked away. Every fear he had buried beneath work and silence. The grief came rushing back, not as an enemy, but as something that had waited patiently for him to be ready. He cried for the sister who used to save the last cookie for him. He cried for the empty chair downstairs. He cried for the stream that no longer had her laughter beside it. He cried for every day he had spent pretending he was fine. Minutes passed. Then hours. The moon climbed higher above the rooftops. Still Thomas cried. Not because he was weak. Not because he had failed. Because he had finally stopped carrying the weight. Alone. At some point during the night, Aunt Clara quietly opened the bedroom door. She found him sitting on the bed, the letter in his lap, tears on his face. For a moment she simply stood there. Then she crossed the room and sat beside him. Neither spoke. No explanations were needed. Clara wrapped one arm around his shoulders. Thomas leaned against her and cried harder than before. The silence between them held more comfort than words ever could. Outside, a soft rain began to fall. Water tapped gently against the roof. The sound filled the darkness like a lullaby. And for the first time since Emily's funeral, the frozen river inside Thomas Miller finally began to flow. The next morning arrived quietly. Sunlight spilled across the village rooftops. Rainwater still clung to leaves and fence posts, catching the early light like scattered pieces of glass. Thomas woke after only a few hours of sleep, yet he felt different. Not rested. Not healed. Simply lighter. The letter remained on the nightstand beside his bed. He looked at it for a moment before getting dressed. For the first time in months, he did not rush downstairs searching for work. He stood by the window instead. He watched the village wake up. Smoke rose from chimneys. A baker opened his shop. Children crossed the road carrying buckets and baskets. Ordinary things. Small things. Somehow they felt beautiful again. Later that afternoon, Thomas walked to the stream. The same stream where Emily had spent so many afternoons. The same stream where he and William Carter had spoken beneath the oak tree. Summer sunlight shimmered across the water. Dragonflies hovered above the surface. Wildflowers nodded gently in the breeze. Thomas sat on the grass and listened. The world no longer felt distant. He could hear everything. Water moving over stones. Wind through leaves. Birds calling from the far bank. Sounds he had ignored for months. After a while, footsteps approached from behind. Thomas glanced over his shoulder. William stood there, hands resting in his pockets. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. Thomas shook his head. William lowered himself onto the grass beside him. For several minutes neither spoke. The silence felt familiar now. Comfortable. Finally William noticed something different. The tension that usually lived in the boy's face had eased. His eyes looked clearer. Present. "You found something," William said quietly. Thomas looked down at the stream. Then he nodded. "A letter." William waited. "From Emily." The breeze stirred the grass around them. Thomas pulled the folded letter from his pocket. The edges had already begun to soften from being handled so often. She wrote it before everything happened. William looked at the envelope but did not ask to read it. Was it helpful? Thomas stared across the water. A faint smile touched his face. "I think it saved me." William said nothing. Some answers deserved silence. The two remained beside the stream for a long time. Eventually Thomas spoke again. "Do you know something strange?" "What is that?" "I thought crying would make everything worse." William nodded slowly. "And?" Thomas watched sunlight ripple across the current. "It hurt." He paused. "But after it was over, I could remember her without feeling afraid." William smiled gently. "That sounds about right." The afternoon drifted forward. Clouds moved lazily across the blue sky. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang. Thomas listened carefully. Months earlier the sound would have reminded him only of loss. Today it reminded him of home. Before leaving, William stood and brushed grass from his uniform. "You are going to be all right, Thomas." The boy looked up. For the first time, he truly believed it. Not because the pain was gone. Not because life had become easy. But because he finally understood something Emily had known all along. Grief was not something a person carried forever in silence. It was something a person walked through. William offered his hand. Thomas stood. The two walked back toward the village together beneath the warm summer sun. Behind them, the stream continued flowing. Ahead of them, life waited. And although Thomas Miller would always miss his sister, he no longer felt trapped inside the day he lost her. The promise had ended. The healing had begun. And somewhere beyond the rooftops and church bells, beyond the memories. And the tears, a 12-year-old boy was finally learning that letting his heart break had not made him weaker. It had given him permission to live again.